Greetings and welcome back to Haftarot, the weekly video cast in which we take a look at the upcoming week's Haftara, understand its underlying message, and, if possible, try to connect it with the content of the Kriyat Torah that precedes it. My name is Yitzchak Etshalom, and I'm delighted to be studying the Haftara of Parashat Matot Masei, which we read this week, the two Parashot together, which are very long. And as I mentioned in last week's video cast, because this is one of the 3 weeks, this is the middle of the 3 weeks between Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, the Haftara itself does not have any obvious direct correlation with Kriyat Torah. What occasions the reading is not the content of the Torah reading, but rather it is the season. However, things may be a little bit more interesting than that. I mentioned last week that this period is called Bein HaMetzarim, or the 3 weeks, and last week we saw the Mishnah that identified 5 terrible things that happened to our ancestors on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and 5 on Tisha B'Av, and I noted that the presentation of the Mishnah established a certain symmetry between them, a symmetry that then developed into an envelope structure, an inclusio, where the 3 weeks, starting with Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and ending with Tisha B'Av, suddenly became a period of sadness. And as such, already preceding that, there were these special haftarot that were selected for the time. As you see here in the pasuk in Eicha, in the beginning of Eicha, the Gimel pasuk, at the beginning of Eicha, Galta Yehuda me'one mirov avodah. Yehuda has been exiled, and oppression and lots of work. He ashva v'goyim lo matzah manoach. She's not finding any rest among the nations. Korodfeha hisiguha ben hametzarim. All of those who chased her caught up with her between the straits, like she was cornered and found. The Midrash has a number of comments on Ben HaMetzarim, and here's one of them. In Eicha Rabbah, which is a relatively early Midrash, Eretz Yisraeli, B'yomin da'aka, in days like these, Mishiva Asar B'Tammuz ad Tisha B'Av. And so you see here already in the Midrash identifying as Ben HaMetzarim, the straits, the narrow straits between these 2 days that are close to each other. And then it makes a comment, which is beyond me as far as understanding what it means. Shebahem Ketef Miriri Sholek, there's a certain demonic force that's got its power during those 3 weeks. And that may be the reason that all these terrible things happen, at least from the view of the Midrash. As I point out here in the English comment, there is a range of practices during this period of the 3 weeks of abstention. In many communities, there are no weddings. In some communities, that only starts with Rosh Chodesh Av. In some places, people avoid other celebratory type things. But in every community, the sense of mourning builds and becomes more intense as we reach Rosh Chodesh Av, and then we reach the week of Tisha B'Av, which this year we don't have. Tisha B'Av is on a Sunday, and then we get Erev Tisha B'Av, and then Tisha B'Av itself is the culmination of that sadness. And the Haftara picks up exactly where we left off last week. It is from the very next verse in Yirmiyahu, which is at the beginning of chapter 2, and goes all the way through the end of chapter 2. And then different communities, because the end of chapter 2 ends on a threatening and sad note, in different communities, there are different psukim that are added on in order to give us a sense of hope and a sense of something positive to look forward to. Our custom in our Chalabi community is to read from the beginning of chapter 4. Im tashuv Yisrael num Adonai elai tashuv. You're going to return to me, says God. So get rid of all of the Vodah Zarah that you have and don't leave, don't move around. V'nishbata chai Adonai be'emet b'mishpat u'tzedakah. And you should take an oath by my name with truth and with justice and righteousness, and all the nations will be blessed through you, and through them you will be praised. Now, this takes us back to 2 weeks ago when we saw the Haftara Parashat Balak, just before we began the 3 weeks, and we saw the Micha's words that what is it that God asked from you? Asot mishpat v'avat chesed, and which is sort of reworded here 100 years later or so by Yirmiyahu, 100 and a little bit years by Yirmiyahu. The bulk of this Haftara is about Bnei Yisrael's searching all over the world to find more interesting avodah zarah to find. They didn't even follow what the other nations do, which is at least to stay with their ancestral avodah zarah or adopt a local avodah zarah where they've been moved, but rather they went on a worldwide search to find exciting avodah zarah to follow, and how degrading that is, and how much they've fallen off of the loyalty that was mentioned at the beginning of the paragraph, was the end of last week's Haftara. However, in a sense, as I mentioned, this may connect with the parasha, even though the Haftarah is occasioned by the season, not by the Torah reading, because in the beginning of Parashat Masei, we read that when we come to the land, we're supposed to uproot all of the nations that worship Avodah Zarah, and if not, they will be thorns in our sides, they will be thistles in our eyes, as it were, they will be the source of our trouble. And that ultimately we will end up falling into their behaviors, and then God will exile us from the land. And so exile from the land, which is a built-in promise to the promise of the land and the command to conquer the land, now comes to its sad realization here in the Haftarah. So in a sense, the Haftarah reflects, as sort of in old film talk, the negative side, the negative imprint of what the Torah promises, and we see that the inability to fulfill the Torah's promise and command properly led to ultimately to the Galut that Yirmiyahu warns us about, and ultimately laments in his masterpiece in Megillat Eicha. We'll leave it at this point. Next week, we're going to take a look at the beginning of Sefer Yeshayahu, the very famous Haftarah of Chazon Yeshayahu, as we prepare for Tisha B'Av. In the meantime, Yirtzeh Hashem, very soon these Haftarot should be turned to Haftarot of consolation, and the period should be turned to a period of rejoicing, of celebration, and ultimately of Geulah, of redemption. Shabbat Shalom.